So hi guys, and welcome to this final video on rare options for black on the third move. Let's put the position on the board: e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to c4. And here, the move that we're going to be covering is this move, pawn to h6. It's the so-called anti-fried liver defense. And it's quite important to know, it might be a bit surprising, but it's actually the third most popular choice at the club level. I guess, though, it's not so surprising because it's very common mark of the amateur player to spend a little bit too much time in the opening making pawn moves, flank pawn moves. Especially a lot of amateur players have learned the hard way, let's say, that sometimes if a knight can land on g5, for example, if you play the move knight f6, and the knight lands on g5, that if you don't know what you're doing, you can get into a lot of trouble here on these traditionally very weak points on f2 and f7. The reason why they're weak points is because the kings are right next to them and they're the only defensive piece. So of course that makes for a lot of attacking motifs based on these points. Therefore, oftentimes at the club level, you will find that players play the move pawn to h6 just to control that g5 square. And we need to know, first of all, this is not a very good move, but we need to know how we can take advantage of it as white. Well, the move that I'm recommending is the move pawn to d4. Why I like this move is because after pawn takes d4, here, by the way, I should say that in this position, white could also castle kingside and have a very good position where this move pawn to h6 is maybe not so useful. But the reason why I prefer d4 is it's a little bit more direct, puts pressure on the center, and pretty much forces black's hands to capture the pawn. Because if, for example, black defends the pawn, now we can take on e5, and we could get a situation where, let's say, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, pawn takes e5, and now we see this classical overloading of the king where it's defending f7 and d8, so white can take this pawn with check when black is not able to capture the bishop without losing his queen. Black would have to play the move king e7, but the position is of course already very, very bad. He is down a pawn and has lost his right to castle. So therefore, if we take the starting position again, in this position here, black cannot defend the pawn on with d6, but instead should capture back on d4. Now, and only now, do I like the possibility of castling. I really like this way of playing because the position is basically like a Scotch gambit where black has included this move, has wasted a tempo with this move pawn to h6, which is really not a useful move at all. So after this, after e takes d4 and castle, black could perhaps try and defend this pawn on d4 and try to refute white's play in this way. So he would play the move bishop to c5. But here the problem is that white has a very good way of putting more pressure on the pawn with c3. White is offering an extra pawn, he's gambiting a pawn, and if black doesn't accept it, if let's say black plays some pawn move to d6, now white will capture pawn takes d4, he will have a very strong center, and he will force black to waste even more time, this time moving the bishop a second time, having wasted time with a flank pawn move. So this is a very bad situation, but the alternative is even worse. In fact, d6 is almost certainly best for black. If black captures this pawn, now after the move bishop takes f7 check, then comes king takes f7, white sacrifices a piece, but we can see why with the next move, queen d5 check, we see the king and the bishop are both under fire. Black can move the king back. White can play a little finesse. He can give a check here on h5 and force the king to a dark square, and then he gets to take the bishop with check And after black blocks the check, now white can collect this pawn on c3. If we take stock of the position, we can see that the material is level, but black has lost his right to castle, and well, his king is extremely unsafe as well. This move h6 has just created weaknesses in the black camp. So overall, the position is really objectively, I think, very close to losing for black, and this is really perhaps the most punishing way of handling the so-called anti-fried liver defense. It's by no means the forced line for black, but it's very natural moves, and I think that if you take this direct approach with white, where you play d4 and you go for something similar to a Scotch gambit, but an improved version of it, you can get a lot of very, very good positions and hopefully quite easy games against the many club players who go for the so-called anti-fried liver defense with that early third move, pawn to h6. Hopefully that's been helpful for you guys on this h6 line. Do not worry too much about it, because although it is quite popular from a theoretical standpoint, you're not going to get many strong players playing like this. So usually if you see it, you should be quite happy that you're going to get an easier game than if black went for more mainline choices. And if you're thinking of playing it as black, to be honest, my advice would be do not. There are many, many better third move possibilities than that. And if you haven't seen earlier videos in this series, we recommend either knight f6 or bishop to c5 to really get a great game where you can play even up to the highest levels. So that's it for me. Hope you've enjoyed this coverage of the rare options and on the Italian, and hopefully if you've liked one or two of them, then give them a shot as black, and otherwise I hope that you get to do well against them from the white side in the future. So see you in the next video.